All right, welcome to Science Fiction Reads. Today I'm joined by Richard at Vintage SF and Ira at Science Fiction Words of Wonder for our second discussion, this time on the best of Leigh Brackett. And last time we opened by kind of discussing our origin stories with science fiction and how we got into reading. And this time I'm going to start it off by asking you guys kind of to describe your vintage collection, your books. Like, do you mostly collect hardcovers, soft covers? Do you prefer vintage copies over, newer editions? Like specific subgenres or a period of decades that you like? And then we'll launch into the best of. So who wants to start?
I could start.
Okay.
So I guess when I was collecting before, I was really into like first edition hardback books. And not only science fiction, I was collecting some horror and some Stephen King and all of that. And then when I kind of got back into collecting, I kind of naturally went towards that. But I was lucky enough to kind of watch some other booktubers talk about how nice and compact paperbacks are. And then I got the idea to build these bookshelves that are behind me that are kind of specific for mass market paperbacks. So that's kind of where I've ended up. And I'm mostly collecting mass market paperbacks. Some of the newer ones are kind of those pocketbooks, the little taller ones. They still fit on my shelves. And I do have a couple other bookshelves where, I have trade paperbacks and some book club hardbacks and things like that. But I'm mostly collecting vintage, but there are some a little bit more contemporary books that still have that maybe aesthetic, the cool covers, like Hyperion from Dan Simmons. I love those four books together on my shelf. I love the way those look. I love the books. So that's kind of where I've ended up. And I guess like I would, if I had to choose between, like a first edition or a first printing that didn't have a great cover and maybe a later printing where they had like better artwork or something, I'm kind of leaning more towards the artwork, where before it was like a big deal for me to always have the first printing or the first edition of something. But now it's kind of more like the aesthetics. And I'm kind of a quality guy too. I like to have the spines nice and clean and the book not to smell too bad. So that's kind of where I'm at.
I started off with the A format trade or paperbacks. I think part of it is I really like the artwork from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so the graphic design of the paperbacks were more attractive to me than they were for some of the hardcovers. And they were also a lot easier to find and often were only a few bucks at the used bookstore. So I definitely started out in that area. There are some new ones that I collect, like those SF Masterworks behind me there. I try to just wait till there's some sales. But once again, those are going towards vintage in terms of the copyrights for the stories that are there. So I primarily, in this library that I have here, the vast majority of it, copyright would be before 1980. And so it's a lot of fun to look for some of the more original paperbacks from that time. One of the things that I'd like to say also is that I collect them to read them. There's very few that I have a reading copy of and a book that I put into a bag. Yeah. And I feel like we may be similar that way. I think one of the reasons that we are into this Ballantine Best of series is because we loved the way the paperbacks looked with their cover art, etc., and collecting them. And so we noticed that among each other's libraries. And fortunately, we got together to discuss them.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. When I started out, I had no preference. I just had I realized I liked this this type of story, science fiction, and I collected hardcover, trade paperback, mass market. But then as the collection grew, it just looked awful on the shelf. Um, and I had like space issues, which I still have. Uh, so mass market paperback was the way to go, because you can fit the most on there. But I also, the more I read, the more I like the older stuff, which predominantly came in smaller paperbacks anyway. So, and like you said, the cover art, you can't really compare it to today. Like up until the early 2000s, like the Dan Simmons stuff, they still look like they fit on the bookshelf because I have those as well. Um, but then the more modern you get, it's not really for me. Um, the the masterworks, like the whatever you call that size of book, like they still fit, so I collect those too. But like you said, Richard, like usually the contents of those larger books is older stuff as well. Even though I like the newer stuff, it's mostly the older stuff, and hunting for old paperbacks and looking for cool artwork is just so much fun. And I've got way more books on my shelves now thanks to kind of upgrading from trade paperbacks and hardcovers. I have one shelf of hardcovers and tons in boxes that I don't have space for right now, but um, it's mostly the older stuff, and I find myself really attracted to like the 70s up until like the 90s too, in terms of artwork and content. So I guess similar to the both of you.
I would just add one area I do like collecting the hardbacks is when it's an 800-page novel. It's a lot easier to read in a hardcover than a paperback version.
And you're probably going to crack the spine of that paperback if it's
Yeah.
800 plus pages. Yeah, I don't. Unless it's like a personal favorite, like A Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. I've specifically sought that out in hardcover, but there's almost nothing that I want in hardcover. Although I do love collecting book club editions, again, for the cover art. Um,
Yeah, I found a few. I think maybe you turned me on to Netsa Press, Matt.
oh, yeah,
And
they're good.
like in my next book haul, I managed to get the Cordwainer Smith, and it's like they put together the complete, all of his short stories in one. And you'd be hard pressed to find those books in other locations and try to read them. And I got the Frederick Brown collections. The way they put those collections together are just pretty good. So I've got a few of those.
Yeah, and they usually have really nice cover art too. Sometimes just lifted from one of the actual books from the past. But yeah, Nespa Press is awesome for kind of curating these old stuff. Like I have one here that I'll refer to it later, but those are a fun one to collect too.
Yep.
All right, so last time we were talking about Hal Clement, and today we're here to discuss Leigh Brackett. I have a couple stats here, some information. She wrote a lot of planetary romance and sword and sorcery, but also mystery, and I think a couple other genres, as well as screenplays for movies. She started writing in the 40s and earned the nickname the Queen of Space Opera, which I think is an awesome title. And she was married to Edmund Hamilton, who, as well as writing the intro to this book, he's also in the best of, which we may get to him eventually. And also one thing he mentioned that was interesting in the intro, something that sparked Leigh Brackett's interest was she just was given a copy of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I think we could clearly see the influence that led from that. The Long Tomorrow, which I have not read, but I'm very much looking forward to. She wrote that and was nominated for a Hugo. And in 2020, she actually won a retro Hugo for the Nemesis from Terra, which is another one I sadly have not read yet. And she's also well known for writing the draft for The Empire Strikes Back, which she finished just shortly before her death. And a lot of her stories take place in, I don't know if you could call it a future history, but certainly they're all connected. She's got a sort of solar system established, and a lot of different strains of humanity living on these planets that are kind of just starting to commingle and come into contact with each other as her stories take place, which I think is a lot of fun. And I think probably 7 out of the 10 stories, or maybe 8 in this collection, are kind of connected into that future world of hers. So I guess we'll start by I'll just ask you guys what your general impression was on the stories and the author herself, her prose, and whatnot. Who wants to start?
I'll start this time.
Okay.
Whenever I'm reading a book, I sometimes have other people come up in my mind. And as you had said in the introduction, when she was a young girl, she received a gift of The Gods of Mars, which is the second Edgar Rice Burroughs story of John Carter. In fact, one of the stories in this book has a pet that's named after John Carter, which is kind of an homage that she overtly puts out there. But I was thinking that she is an upgrade in prose and I think I'll just stay with the prose and prose in her stories. There are a lot of similarities to Edgar Rice Burroughs in terms of the planetary romance type of thing. Sometimes a high body count in the stories, as there's a lot of sword and not so much sorcery, but there's a little bit of that too. And the other one that I thought of, there's some stories that don't occur on these planets of Mars and Venus and Mercury that she has. There are stories that remind me a lot of the old Twilight Zone from the early 1960s. They're a setup of a situation with sometimes an unexpected ending or a bittersweet type of ending to the stories.
Yeah, I would agree. It's pretty obvious the influence from Edgar Rice Burroughs. Definitely her prose is so much better. And Edgar's great. You know, he's just a little more descriptive, maybe. I thought she had a definitely more poetic prose, little touch of fantasy, but the way she could describe some of these environments on these other planets, I was thinking to myself, it's a real bummer that we kind of debunked that there could be life on any other planets, because no one's writing about this stuff anymore. But back then, when maybe we didn't know, there was speculation that there was life on Mars. It just opened up this avenue to be so creative and come up with like the different life within our solar system and how we could interact with them. So I think overall, I really like the book, or all the short stories. I feel like this isn't kind of my go-to genre to go to as much, kind of the pulpier books, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I just loved her prose, and it really made me want to read some more of her other works, especially like you mentioned, The Long Tomorrow. That'll be the next book I read from her.
You know, that prose really does paint pictures. I automatically think about Venus and that ocean of gas type water that there is that they can be in, and the beautiful colors of it, and it's quite amazing, beautiful to read.
Yeah, and then I guess the other thing I kind of forgot to mention, she brings a little bit more of like the human condition and that into some of the stories, which it's not just all fighting. And I mean, in a short story, there was some characters that you really kind of got to like in some of the stories, which is kind of hard to do in a short format like that. So she's a great writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, couldn't agree more that it's taking Edgar Rice Burroughs' characters and themes and kind of uplifting it. And I'll just say, wait till you get to C.L. Moore, because it's yet another uplift in quality. It's incredible, but we'll get there one day. But something that you said, Ira, just sparked my memory. That nobody really writes this stuff anymore. I'm just going to check when this was published here. 2006. S.M. Stirling wrote 2 books purposely in a pulpy style that take place on Mars, and one takes place on Venus. I have not read the second one, but I imagine it takes place on Mars. And I just wish more people did stuff like that. I think there might be anthology collections where the authors were prompted to write, pulpy type stuff, but yeah, certainly really cool. I forgot to mention that as the years went on, Leigh Brackett kind of stopped writing in this world as kind of, scientific advances took place. And she even took her character, John Stark, who features in a bunch of her stories, and moved him to another solar system. So she could basically keep telling similar stories, which in itself is a cool idea. But she could have kept writing, the same stories in the same settings, would have been fine by me. I wouldn't say her characters are crazy well developed, but somehow in a short period you get to feel for them, and you really feel their loss. And she really does not hold back with bittersweet moments and endings at times. That's how I was really blown away by her. I don't think I mentioned, I did read this collection earlier, like a year or so ago. And this time around, I read about 2/3 of it. But that was what really struck me was not a lot of people are writing stories where, sometimes it does not end well for the main character. And you're just left with this feeling in your heart. I don't know. Not a lot of authors have done that for me. And I think she was my introduction to sword and sorcery and planetary romance too, which might be coming at it from a strange angle. Although not so much if you're into science fiction, because, these are kind of science fantasy stories as well. All right, so there were 10 stories here. Do you guys have any favorites or any that really stuck out?
I can start on this one, I guess.
Good. Yeah.
The intro was really good. First, I just want to mention something about that because, her husband wrote the intro, and he was talking about how they moved to Ohio later in life. And there's some things just really stuck out in that intro about how, like, he bought a 22 caliber rifle to shoot the groundhogs, but then they kind of became friends with them and he never got to shoot any of them. And it was just like, I don't know, it was really touching. And I found out, he passed away. It was like maybe 7 or 8 months after he wrote that introduction. And then the dedication of the book was to him. So kind of a, bittersweet intro to the stories, which a lot of them, like you said, are bittersweet as well.
And Leigh Brackett herself passed away just a year after him as well. So they both passed away quite early, in their early 60s.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I liked a lot of the stories. You're talking about some of the Twilight Zone feeling stories. I liked some of those that you never knew where she was going to go with some of those. But as far as the planetary books, I'm a real visual reader. So when she was describing all these areas and the landscape and the creatures, the plants, the animals, I just fell in love with all those stories mostly. And one that stood out for me was The Moon That Vanished. And that was the one about on, let me get this right. I think it was on Venus. Yeah, there was, there used to be a moon and then it had crashed into the planet and kind of created this like radioactive area almost. And we had a character who had gone to this area and returned. He was, I think, trying to get these like godlike powers. And most people that went there, I think, died of radiation poisoning. But he managed to like make it back. And then he discovers this couple that wanted to go there as well. And he kind of like leads them along the way, and they get chased by that cult, the Children of the Moon. And so there was like all that adventure kind of built into the story. And then it kind of becomes a weird love triangle, but it does get, I liked the ending. I liked what happened. And there was kind of definitely a bittersweet ending in that one as well. So that was probably one of the standouts for me in the collection.
I like how the main character in that one, he kind of surmises, like, probably, this whole, the veil of the moon or whatever they were calling it, the mist, it's probably a form of radiation from the moon that they used to have. But, they have this whole cult about it and whatever. But this is what I think. He basically puts it together for himself. But I thought that was neat. because he's an Earthman, right? He may have a little more knowledge or a different way of thinking than the Venusians.
Yeah, it's almost like the difference between science fiction and fantasy. You know, the Children of the Moon, I think it was a fantasy element, and he was thinking it rationally. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. I guess I should go next here. The one I'm going to choose is The Veil of Astellar or Astellar. In this one, they have a forward and then they have little chapters within here. These stories are actually more like novellas, I think, that she has in this book. So in the forward, it reminded me of A Planet of the Apes. They have a forward like this too. It's like a found manuscript that that we have here, and this found manuscript explains how this one man is basically doomed two races of people at different times. This is a story of space vampires again. We talked about that in the last book that we were looking at. And, but once again, Leigh Brackett just puts on it such a beautiful twist and her prose and the beauty of the story. We have a spaceship that is making a stop on Mars, and we discover that one of the people on that spaceship is has a locket, and in that locket there is a picture of a man who is an ancestor of hers, and there's another person that's been on that rocket that looks like this man. So that sort of starts out our mystery, and we also have a death on Mars that is part of the mystery. And as we keep on going, we find out that the main character, his name is J. Goetz, and it's actually the J is an initial that stands for Judas. So Judas Goetz. And if you know what a Judas goat is, and you can look it up on Wikipedia if you want, but there's a little explanation in the story too. A Judas goat is a goat that is kind of herding the herd, and it herds them into stock pens, etc., for slaughter. But the Judas goat doesn't get slaughtered, they get rewarded. And so we find out that Jay Goetz literally is a Judas goat. He's herding people towards an interdimensional planet or station that is in these veils in space, sort of veils that are interdimensional. And when these people get there, they're hypnotized and eventually going to be led into this room of crystals, which is going to take their life force or energy. And these people from this planet and the humans that they've recruited to be these Judas goats will gain that life force and gain eternal life and health. That's the setup for the story. But the idea of that locket and this guy looking like an ancestor of hers is actually true. And it harkens back to his romance on Earth with someone who is an ancestor of hers. And so we have, once again, a bittersweet story of him remembering his first love on Earth, feeling guilty about the things that he's been doing. And then how is that going to change his attitude towards the people of this veiled planet, interdimensional planet? I loved it. If it had been made into a Twilight Zone episode, I bet you it would have been one of the top 10 Twilight Zone episodes that people would talk about.
Yeah, that one blew me away too.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites. The way he kind of, the way Leigh Brackett kind of gave some stuff away in that forward, and so you knew something was going to get solved. There's some plot points that were kind of given away, but you just didn't know how it was going to happen. And then, yeah, the main character's dilemma, and kind of goes to show it's never too late to maybe do the right thing.
Yeah, and one of her, which you come to find is like a classic ending, kind of like a tortured soul type thing. It blew me away.
Mm-hmm.
She has a lot of characters like that.
Yeah. And once again, I'm just going to use the word beauty. There's just such a beauty to her writing, and even in her character development, I guess you could almost say that it leans almost towards a soap opera style, but it's her writing just elevates it so much.
Yeah, I would say if someone just wanted to read one story out of here, that would be the one I would probably recommend to people.
And it doesn't strike me as something that was written in 1944. Like, it feels a little newer than that. That's
Yeah.
another thing that surprised me when I first read her was I didn't know there were stories like this that early.
There's a timeless quality to her writing. You can pretty much read any of her stories, and yeah, we know what's on Venus and Mars and Mercury, but uh, you just don't worry about that. This is just
Yeah.
another planet, and these people are uh, going through some melodrama.
Yeah, it kind of goes back what I was saying. She brings that human condition, and you kind of realize, we think we've changed, but we really haven't. You can go back and read Greek mythology, and we're basically doing the same things. And she just puts it in, the poetic prose and the settings, and she puts it all together really well.
Okay, so for my favorite, or the one that stuck out to me, I was torn between The Last Days of Chanticleer and The Jewel of Boss, but I already made a video kind of recapping The Last Days of Chanticleer, just a
It's
retelling.
excellent. By the way,
Oh,
if you
thank
haven't
you.
watched it, people who are watching now, you should watch it.
Unless you don't want read it first, because it is basically, it's a retelling of the story, just shortened. Just something new I was trying. So I'll talk about The Jewel of Boss, which was also written in 1944, and probably has the earliest depiction that I've read of the word android and androids. Like, again, when I read this, I was like, those androids are described as, modern day ideas of androids. But it's the first story in the collection, and we're following, I think they're somewhat newlyweds, Kieran and Mouse. And I think Kieran is kind of like a bard. He sings songs to make money. And I think they're also kind of thieves. Mouse, we don't get to know much about their past, but Mouse has kind of like a brand, I think, on her forehead, just to prove that, she's a thief. She was caught as a thief in the past. And I think we open up and they're kind of camping in the wilderness kind of thing, or they're between towns or something. And I think Kieran's kind of reflecting on some of the songs he sings, and some of the world building I think we get through his music and folklore and stuff. But they end up being kind of taken prisoner by these creatures that are basically from a song that he has heard and sung, and they're kind of being led to this mountain that's been, off limits. It's in this kind of wasteland, and every so often things are starting to click in his head, and he's thinking, some of these legends that I sing about, they might actually be true. It seems like as events progress here, some of the ancient mystery of our world are maybe not just fables and stories. And they get taken with some other prisoners to this mountain, which I guess in the world's history has always been kind of off limits. And there's a legend that there's some sort of stone of destiny in this place that could kind of control the world. And there's legends of this boss, the ruler, who maybe created the world, maybe not. And they get taken to this place, and Kieran and Mouse and a couple others manage to escape within the confines of the mountain, and they kind of witness something that they don't have words for, because they live in a very medieval type world, and the reader can tell that they're looking at some kind of machine that's being constructed by slaves like themselves, except they escaped. But these slaves are basically brainwashed, and they're just working themselves to death. And it seems like the people running this operation are these two inhuman creatures, which again feature in some of the world's folklore and old myths. And Kieran is thinking, this stuff is real. Like there really might be a boss who created the world, and those are his android servants. And uh, through some mishaps, Mouse is basically brainwashed, and it's down to Kieran now. Kieran needs to save the day, and he does have an encounter with this god. And the whole time I'm reading this, well, in hindsight, but also this is the second time I've read it, I'm trying to see, can I fit this story into her wider world of her 3 planets? It seems like this story is taking place in a hollow world, and at first you're wondering if it's constructed or if it's a planet that's being hollowed out. I was really impressed by all the world building, and again, a lot of the stuff that happens in this story for the early 40s, I just didn't think stuff like this was written that early, and I was blown away. And I won't spoil any of the ending, but I love the world building. I love the characters. These characters might have a little more, they might be a little more fleshed out than some of her others. I just loved it. I don't know if you guys have anything to say about that one in particular.
Well, that was the first book or the first short story in this collection, right?
Yeah.
And I thought it set the tone perfectly because you kind of got a lot of elements that she dug into a little bit deeper, but it kind of had a little bit of everything in it. And while it wasn't my favorite, I don't think they ever want to start a collection with like the top story, but it set the
Right.
tone to me for the rest of the book and all the elements that she kind of got to flesh out a little bit more in the rest of the stories.
And one
Yeah.
interesting thing is this book was formed chronologically. Her husband, in editing it, chose to do it by the date of publication of these stories. So this was her very first story they chose to be in here.
I
Yeah,
didn't
and
know
I think
that.
the first 3 or 4 were all written in 44. So she had one hell of a year.
You know what? I've
Yeah.
been thinking about her in the Second World War too. Some of the bittersweet type of endings and relationships, I think there can really be potentially brought back to seeing people go off to war and never knowing if they're going to return. I sometimes think about when stories are written in history and how that may have influenced the heart of the writer.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
I also loved how the character of Kieran is interacting with this godlike entity, and since he's a bard, sometimes he emphasizes his points by like strumming his guitar or strumming a couple chords. I thought that was funny. She does put humor into her characters here and there. I don't know. Is there any other stories you guys wanted to touch on?
The one you mentioned about the little creature, the tweener.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, that was a fun book that kind of got dark. A couple of the stories I thought were going to have a lighthearted feel to them, and she really twists and turned a bit, you know. And then the one that reminded me the most of like an old Twilight episode was the one about the TV repairman, or he kind of plays a part in the book or the short story.
That one's the last one, called The Queer Ones, I believe.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
like
that
an
one was-
alien invasion story, that one.
Yeah, very similar to the premise of a Chad Oliver book, Shadows in the Sun, where for whatever reason, humanoid aliens from other worlds are kind of covertly inhabiting maybe small rural towns for whatever means. And we have a character, actually in both stories, who's a reporter, which I wonder which of these was written first. But we have a reporter who's kind of stumbled onto this story.
The Queer Ones is 1956.
I couldn't find it, but
Okay.
It's just curious that they're very similar, and both characters were reporters. But yeah, so after I read Brackett for the first time, I went on and read tons of her stuff, lots of her short stories, but I still have plenty left, which I might start digging into after this reread.
So maybe you can. So one of the characters that showed up in at least one, maybe two of these stories was John Eric Stark. Is that the name?
Yeah.
And she wrote a whole series based on him. Is that correct?
Yeah, she wrote a trilogy about him. Well, he appeared in multiple stories. I think he was an Earthborn human who grew up on Mercury and then has various adventures on Venus and Mars. But then once science was making advances and she decided she didn't really want to write stories set on our solar system anymore, she just transplanted him to another solar system.
Okay.
Which is a cool idea. I have them, but I have not read those yet. But the John Stark character is pretty cool too. I haven't read any Conan the Barbarian, but I assumed he was kind of similar to that character. Very strong. He can always get out of a situation. Maybe smarter than the average person that he encounters.
Uh-huh.
I think there's a few characters I think that reappear throughout her stories.
When I look at the list of stories, there's two others that sort of stand out to me. Enchantress of Venus, to me, is one of his best world building adventure sword and planetary romance stories. So if you're looking for one of those stories that really kind of represent Edgar Rice Burroughs in an amazing form, that's one I'd recommend out of here. And the other one is The Woman from Altair, where we have a space merchant coming back to his space merchant family with a wife, an alien wife, and things are not as they seem. Here we go in the Twilight Zone again. So if you like those type of stories, that one's for you too.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you guys for your overall impression and rating, and also like who would you recommend these stories to? So for me, I think I'd count the collection like a 4.5 out of 5. The ones I liked the least were the ones that weren't actually related to her, solar system stuff, but they were still, they're all so good. And as someone who had never read Sword and Sorcery or Planetary Romance really beforehand and was really taken with it, I pretty much would recommend it to anyone who's curious or has enjoyed science fantasy in the past, because it really blew me away. I think before this, the only science fantasy Sword and Sorcery type stuff I had read was maybe C.J. Cherryh's Morgaine saga, which is, I think, 4 books about a character on some backward worlds, but she's kind of from a stellar civilization. But this stuff is a cut above that. But yeah, I'll just ask you guys, what's your overall impression and rating, and who would you maybe recommend these stories to?
I would give it an 8 out of 10. It's strong. It's very strong. And as we've been discussing, I think there's sort of 2 different types of stories that she liked to tell. And it depends if you like one or the other or both. I thought it was fun to read both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I give it a solid 4. I think I had read Edgar Rice Burroughs before, and Edgar Rice Burroughs might be a hard person to pitch to a modern reader. But if they want to get a feel for that, I would definitely say to read Leigh Brackett. And now I'm curious to read Seal Moore after Matt gave her the glowing reviews too.
I can't wait for you guys to read it and discuss her with you.
Yeah, and so, for one, watch Matt's video on the last days of Shandakor, and I think you could watch that and you could still go back and read the book and get enjoyment out of it. And if you like that style, that, everything he's talking about and the story he's rehashing there, then you'll get a lot more of that with these stories. Or a lot of them are along those lines, besides the kind of weirder ones. But like you said, those were still fun too.
Mhm.
That story in particular reminded me of Ray Bradbury and his Mars series, The Martian Chronicles. They were actually very good friends, along with Heinlein as well. So, uh, yeah, there's definitely some notes of Bradbury in her writing too,
I think
or
she,
her notes in his writing.
yeah, I think she collaborated with Bradbury on something, at least one story. He was also the best man at their wedding, Hamilton and Leigh Brackett. So that's cool too. And of course, they were close friends with C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, which is very cool.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I would say is I'm a sucker for a plot twist, and she throws quite a few plot twists into her stories. So
Yeah, absolutely.
One
Okay,
other note I'd
well,
like to add. I was just
yeah,
going to add, you talked about her writing the first draft of The Empire Strikes Back, and then she passed away. But George Lucas asked her specifically to write a first draft for him based on his outline, and you can find that online. There's
oh,
definitely a
cool.
lot of notes that she hit that are in that movie.
Yeah, I don't know too much about it, but I did hear that a lot of her stuff did make it in, kind of thing. Yeah, very cool. Okay, well, if that's it, then I'm going to thank you guys for joining me for this second discussion. And I know we're going to have another probably a month from now, which will be on Ira's channel. And I believe we've chosen The Best of Frederick Brown, which
yep.
I'm fairly certain will be new to me. May have
I've
read
read
one
one
before.
of his novels, and I got to say, whenever I do a book haul or something comes up, I get so many comments from the community about you got to read his short work, you got to read his novels, you got to read everything, and he throws, from what I can tell, he throws quite a bit of humor in his stories, so it should be a fun one.
Yeah, I may have read one short story, but other than that, it'll be new to me. All
Yeah,
right.
I haven't read them either, so I'm looking forward to it.
I think that'll be the case with a lot of these collections. I think a lot of these guys are and women are new to us, which is makes it all the more fun to discuss going in totally green. All right,
That's the
guys.
amazing
Well,
part of that's the amazing part of this whole collection, I think, is it really brings in a lot of authors that people haven't heard of today.
I know, and they're supposed to be the best of, and yet so many of us haven't read them. But from what I've read, like, it's totally justified. I've read, I think, 5 or 6 now, and I was eager to read more from every one of these authors.
Yep, it'll be a fun series.
It will. And yes, next episode will be on Ira's channel. So thanks for joining me, guys. This was fun. And
Thank you.
we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks.